Everyone has a story, but not everyone gets to tell it. Life gets busy. We talk, we text, but do we listen? Are you looking for real stories, raw and unchanged? Want to experience life through another's eyes, one story at a time? Daniel and Jenny have you covered. It's time to start the conversations, and that's the #truth.
Today's guest is Debi Lewis. Debi is the author of the parenting and food memoir, Kitchen Medicine: How I Fed My Daughter Out of Failure to Thrive. She has written for outlets including the New York Times, Bon Appetit, Huffington Post, Romper, Wired, and more. She lives in the Chicago suburbs with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. You can learn more about Debi by visiting her website at debilewis.com or follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Growth the Sunshine. Debi, thank you so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you with us, and we're so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So we've been reading up on all the work that you've been doing, and you have a really extensive and impressive writing background. So have you always been a lover of books? What kind of fuels your passion for writing?
Yeah, sure. I remember very distinctly at the age of 9 getting one of those books you fill in, all about me, where you answer the questions, and I remember writing. The question was, "What are you going to be when you grow up?" And I had written an author, and so
Cool.
at long last, I'm finally here. But yes, I've always loved reading. I've always loved writing. I went to both undergraduate and graduate school for creative writing, but was always a fiction writer, and continue to be. I'm working on some fiction as well. But in graduate school, I remember my professors always asking me, "When are you going to write about your own experiences in your own life?" And at the time I said, "Because nothing interesting has happened to me." I'm not sure I would have asked for this particular kind of interesting that has happened, but there certainly have been gifts and messages in it too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Now, so your most recent book, Kitchen Medicine: How I Fed My Daughter Out of Failure to Thrive, is set to release on March 15th. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, March 15th.
Well, first, I just want to say congratulations. That's really exciting. But second, I really just want to say thank you because it's such an important and necessary piece of work that needs to be out there. Can you tell us just a little bit about your inspiration and motivation behind writing this?
Sure. So when my daughter was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition at about 13 months old, um, the way that the doctors described it to us was that this was not terribly uncommon condition, that it was kind of a one and done surgery to correct it, and that they didn't see follow up from these kids usually. They just never saw them again because they went on to live normal, healthy lives. But that, for my daughter, turned out not to be true. And because even though in the world of congenital heart defects, it is not an uncommon one, in the world at large, it is quite uncommon. And there aren't support groups or systems in place for this. There's a little bit of stuff online at the time. Now there's more, but at the time there was very little. And there just wasn't anybody who could reflect back our experience to us to help us understand what might come next, to help us understand how we could better support our daughter. And it was hard and lonely. And I spent a lot of time Googling all kinds of things, looking for our story. The other piece of writing advice I always got in all of my programs in school was write the book you need to read. Mm-hmm. And I needed this story and it didn't exist. And there are thousands of parents out there who probably would love to see their own fears and their own experiences, their own deeper thoughts reflected back at them. If nothing else good could come out of this experience, at least that could.
Now, with your particular story, when did you start to notice, gosh, I think we're having some feeding problems here? And what did that look like?
For Sammy, it was when we started feeding her solid foods. For those who don't have the full background, Sammy's diagnosis, which came over 6 months after we started solid foods, was called a vascular ring. It's a ring of artery around the esophagus and trachea, but we didn't know it was there. So when we started feeding her, you can imagine what it would feel like to someone to swallow when there is a ring around their esophagus compressing it. I'd had an older daughter who could not have been more enthusiastic about solid food. She was hilariously enthusiastic about it. So this was really bizarre to me. Whereas my older daughter would open her mouth so comically wide that people would come to watch us feed her. My younger daughter would make a tiny little O and barely let the tip of the spoon in for things like purees. And when it was time to start eating, finger foods, she just didn't like it. She wasn't interested. And I kept asking her pediatrician, what should I be worried about? When should I know to be worried? And she was very, like a lot of pediatricians who think they've seen it all. It's like, some kids take a little longer. Some, just keep being at it. Just keep being patient. But when she was over a year old, she had the third respiratory infection that landed her in the hospital. And at that point, the pediatrician suggested we go back to the ear, nose, and throat doctor who had originally diagnosed her with reflux and a little floppy tissue in her larynx. And when he asked us about solid foods and how they were going, and we told him about this, I almost could see the antennas raising out of his head. Oh, that's interesting. And I think he knew immediately what the problem was, but he was cautious and did some tests and determined pretty quickly that there was external compression on her esophagus. So that was when we first figured out there was something going wrong with feeding. But at that point, we thought that would solve the problem.
And then how old was she at that point?
14 months. So at 14 months, she had the first surgery to release this vascular ring. A few weeks later, they dilated her esophagus to make it more open. And the help that came from that lasted about 4 days. And then she went right back to, not eating much at all. But like a lot of parents, I was told to just be patient. Just wait, just hang in there. It took a long time.
I'm thinking about that, and you're going through this. You can tell something's wrong. This is your baby, so you want to do anything you can to make it better. And you're probably grasping, like, what about this? What about this? You're trying everything that you can possibly think of. When did you start to say, wait a minute, I think this might work? Or I think, when did you start to notice the little details that helped guide a way for you?
I wish I could say that there was a time like that, but I mean, we had taken her to the doctor. She'd had surgery. We'd had a follow-up, and everyone just told me to try to get more weight on her. That was the constant refrain. She's failure to thrive, Mom. She's still failure to thrive. Try to get some more calories into her, as though that wasn't like my entire life trying to
right.
Get child. So I read in the book about the Googling of things, and the number one thing I was constantly searching for was high calorie vegetarian foods for babies, right? Because we were vegetarian, and I wasn't ready to give her meat. Although eventually we tried that, it wasn't any better than anything else. And so the thing that I found when she was between a year and 2 years old that was the most helpful was an ingredient called extra virgin coconut oil. Extra virgin coconut oil at room temperature looks a little bit like Vaseline. It's very thick, but when it hits anything that's even a little warm, it just sort of disappears into it. It's a very thin oil. And so once I realized I could add this, I think it was like 150 calories a tablespoon into things like soup, and I would melt it onto blueberries and then coat them in powdered sugar, and then she would do that. And we managed to get her sort of out of the range where the pediatrician was going to insist on a feeding tube. So I was always trying to innovate in the kitchen to find things that would keep us from the next intervention. I was really, really desperate not to have her on a feeding tube. And she always sort of just barely made it work. She would eat the things she liked. And I would amp up the calories as best I could. I also nursed her until she was almost 3, because she was always very enthusiastic about breast milk. And so, we kind of limped along for a long, long time, giving her the foods that she was willing to eat, and not pushing too hard on the things that she didn't like, even if they would have given her more calories.
This is probably years that you battled with this. How do you decide what pieces of this story do I put in a book? Like, um, because it's all helpful, useful information. You must have just a wealth of knowledge and a million different things that you've tried. So, how do you narrow that down?
Well, so this is the thing about traditional book publishing, right? That I'm learning as I go. That book publishers are, with certainly with some exceptions, they're looking to publish books that will sell, and they're looking for keywords that people search for, and that sort of thing. And I have a full draft of this book sitting in my computer that is not being published, that is much more focused on the medical misdiagnosis phase of this experience. But it went out on submission with my agent in January of 2020. And we all know what happened in March of 2020, when the world was really there was not a strong appetite for a book about a sick baby in the middle of a global pandemic. And so, with my agent's help, I went back, sort of the story of the blind men and the elephant, where all these blind men are standing around an elephant, and each of them describes it differently based on what angle they're at. I sort of took another tour around the elephant that was this story, and decided to write it from the angle of food and feeding, which was certainly the largest component of the story. And, when I thought about it, a little bit more universal of a perspective, because there's lots of reasons why kids, can't or won't eat enough or fast enough. And some of them are related to things like what Sammy experienced, but there's lots of other reasons that kids struggle. And I wanted to hit as many people as I could. So certainly parents struggling with all kinds of feeding challenges, we're going to find some usefulness in this book on feeding. So all of the anger with the medical practitioners that we dealt with, and a lot of the other pieces of this story are in the murdered darlings folder on my computer.
But the struggle is real, and when you are thinking back, what were some of the challenges, and have those changed over the years, in terms of medical advancements and more information out there?
I hope so. I've gotten better over the years at being an advocate for myself, my children, my partner, because you learn as you go with something like this about how to ask the right kinds of questions, how to push back gently without insulting someone, all of that kind of stuff. My hope is that in particular, there's a protocol for diagnosing eosinophilic esophagitis, which is a secondary diagnosis Sammy got after the first cardiac surgery. That diagnosis, without giving too much of the book away, turned out to be false. And she was treated for 3 years for a disease she didn't have. My dearest hope is that the protocol for diagnosing that disease has changed, and that the thinking around it has changed, especially for idiopathic cases like what Sammy's sort of wasn't, but we thought it might be. So that I hope has changed. I think the online resources for parents in all kinds of medical situations have really changed drastically, because we are so much more interconnected. There's so much more sharing of information. When Sammy first surgery happened was 2006. There wasn't Facebook. It didn't exist, right? So I was in Yahoo groups, if anybody remembers Yahoo anymore. And so that there's a lot more sharing of information, and so I hope that some things have changed more. But I think the medical system in general and the medical community in general makes it hard, and not just the fault of practitioners, but sort of the culture around medicine makes it very hard for doctors to say they've made a mistake. It makes it very hard for patients and their families to get to the bottom of mistakes without, just suing, which is not something we wanted to do.
Right.
So there's still a lot of room for improvement in the wider culture and in the medical community.
No, that's a really good point. Is you're traveling down a path of, but I think this is wrong, or I think we're on the wrong track, that it could easily raise defenses for that fear of, wait, but my license is on the line, or there's this liability if I get it wrong. That does make it hard. You're right. I hadn't really thought about that aspect of it, but it's true.
Or if you make a mistake,
Mhm.
yeah,
So when everybody realized, oh gosh, this isn't what's going on, and here's the real issue, did that change the approach of the care team at all?
it was really sad because what happened was the care team dissolved. She had been seen by gastroenterologists who were treating this disease that we can only surmise now that it was not the correct diagnosis because they stopped returning phone calls and never connected with us again. When you move from one specialty practice into another, it's almost like hopping from one silo into another. There's much less collaboration in medical systems than you would think, even in the same hospital, even if it's a matter of just taking an elevator down one floor. It's really siloed. So we went from getting an order for a test from gastroenterology to engaging with cardiothoracic surgery in a matter of a week, and then gastroenterology disappeared. So yeah, I will shout out in a really loving way. The cardiothoracic surgery team was incredible. The doctor who did Sammy's first and last cardiac surgeries now works for University of Cincinnati and Kentucky Children's Hospitals. His name is Carl Backer. Many other families within the congenital heart disease community know about Dr. Backer, and he was wonderful, compassionate, kind, and skilled. I'm really grateful for him and his team.
If you could go back, or you could be in the midst of these hospitals while these things are going on, because there are breakdowns for different systematic reasons, and you could be that person to go there and say, hey guys, this is what we have to do different. What would you think would be the biggest thing to kind of make change?
Well, I think there's some very realistic things that could be done, not even by doctors, but simply by programmers. I don't know how many people have sat there and watched their doctors tap into the electronic charting systems, but in my day job, I make websites for a living, and I have a rudimentary understanding of how databases work. And I have this fantasy in my head that, when any doctor says, I'm going to examine X body part, that a pop-up would come up on a screen that says, did you know this body part was examined in 2006 by this doctor in this other practice? You should ask him if there's any connection, right? If there could be these just triggers in the system that alerted doctors that this has been an issue before. Even if it said, you're about to examine, I'm going to make up an example, you're about to examine the nose. Did you know that there was surgery done on the tonsils? Just so that it triggers a moment of thought. Could there be a connection? Should I make a quick phone call? Right? That would be the easiest thing. And if that had happened, it would have saved my daughter 3 years of elimination diets, 13 endoscopies with biopsies, days and days out of school, days of work missed for my husband and I, and so much worry and heartache.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. You talk about all of those things that you went through that weren't necessary. That's going to be hard to think about, that you went through all of these things and it could have been averted, it could have been avoided, but yet you learn from it and you say, but here, take our experience and learn from it, take our experience and move forward. What was that like for you guys going through all of that, just as parents, all the feeding aside, the medical aside, here's your baby, you can't quite fix it. Ugh, for people out there going through the same thing, what would you say to them?
You're not wrong to be overwhelmed. You're not failing as a parent if you don't know what to do, and if you're frustrated, upset, angry even, and feeling really lost. It's not your fault. You're really doing the best you can. I think by default, whatever we do is the best that we can do. And so it's not a zero-sum game. If you can't solve the problem, you're still giving your children love and compassion and trying and working on it. And so, I mean, I think, I wish somebody could have said that to me. You're doing your best and you're doing well. Your children know that you're fighting for them. But at the same time, I mean, it's painful. It's awful. Every elimination diet component meant so much work for me, cooking and figuring out and following up and reading labels and making sure there was a snack at school for my kid when there was cupcakes for everyone else, and bringing food to every family gathering for her. And I mean, it just is unending. And then I made a commitment to Sammy, to my daughter, that I would not let her fall asleep in an operating room alone. And so I went into the operating room every single time and waited with her as she fell asleep. And that's traumatic. Children fall asleep in the operating room sometimes in ways that's really hard to watch. And so I'm traumatized. It was really hard. So I wish there was more support for parents in these kind of strange, idiopathic diagnoses that there isn't going to be a support group for. I wish there was triggers within hospital systems, within medical practices, to check in on the parents. It's painful and hard. If you're struggling, if you're anxious, depressed, worried, not able to manage your own stuff as well, that makes sense. It's really hard.
And especially with, chronic illnesses. I recently read a term, or, I don't know if it's in the DSM yet, but I read a term called chronic traumatic stress syndrome, which is a little bit different than post-traumatic because it's ongoing. It's not, something that happened once and is having a lasting impact, but something that you face again and again and again. And that's hard to come out from under that cloud without having that support.
Yeah. I mean, I will say writing about it was really good for me, and talking about it, I'm getting less sort of initial trauma response every time I talk about it than the time before. But for years, there were stories I couldn't tell without sort of my body going back into that mode of panic, where my heart raced, my armpits sweat. Sometimes I felt a little faint, this weird feeling of all the blood rushing away from my ankles. There are stories I still can't tell without that happening. And even though in the moment, I held it all together very, very well. I can't believe how I did. Now I find it hard to watch a blood draw, even though I was perfectly fine in my daughter's hospital room, watching them, milk things out of a chest drainage tube coming out of a rib cage. That was fine, but a blood draw now makes my skin crawl. So it is trauma, and it is hard, and it's going to take a long time for anyone to kind of, even after the crisis has passed, to breathe and let that feeling of we're safe now really sink in.
I was reading that your daughter compared you to, is it a Disney princess? Okay.
No,
it's not princess, but Disney
character.
Julieta Mariel, who's the
Yes.
The mom in the new movie Encanto.
Yeah.
The movie is very sweet. I really recommend it to everyone. I have teenagers and we still watch this sweet Disney movie. But the character Julieta, everyone in this family has a magical ability, and Julieta's magical ability is to heal everyone through her food. So she makes whatever she makes will take care of your broken arm, your cough, your bee sting, etc. Yeah.
And she said that, hey, Mom, she's you, or you're her, right?
Yeah, that's what she said.
I read that and I was like, it actually made me choke up a little bit because I was like, oh my gosh, it's like that moment of, hey, look, everything I did worked, made an impact.
Yes.
All my efforts got recognized,
I was just gonna say
I'm very lucky that that my My kids I have great kids. I've never been had to experience that, like, oh no, teenagers are a terrible thing. Like, they've been delightful, really. I love them. And they are very appreciative of the cooking that I do. And I write in the book that, this kitchen medicine that I'm writing about is as much for Sammy as it is for me. The medicine for me was having something I could do that would help somehow, right? That when your kid is really sick, even if all you can do is hold a cool rag over their forehead, it's something. It makes you feel useful and that you're doing something. And for me, all that cooking was, gave my anxious, nervous self something to put that energy into. And I'm a pretty good cook now, which is great. And I like my food. And Sammy, particularly, this little girl who could not eat, you would never know if you sat with her for a day and watched what she eats and how she eats and how much she enjoys it. It is such a blessing. I mean, I feel really, really grateful.
And so there's no longer, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Push the
No,
calories or anything. It's just all better. That's
yeah,
incredible.
she's really all better.
When you were going through all that, looking up what to make and what to cook, I'm guessing you didn't just do a search and you got all the answers you wanted. You probably had to put a lot into all of that. And your website says that you're a MacGyver in the kitchen. So where does the whole MacGyver come into the stuff that you found?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I've just basically lived in Google for a long time, just trying to find the information that I was looking for. When she was littler, we're looking for higher calorie foods. That was not too hard. There's people out there looking to, increase their calories and for all kinds of reasons. But when she was older, when she was diagnosed with eosinophilic esophagitis, the first line of treatment is to do something called the 6-food elimination diet, which is dairy, soy, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, and fish. Dairy, soy, eggs, wheat, nuts, fish. So tree nuts, peanuts, and then all kinds of fish, right? So that's the 6 things. We were already vegetarians. We didn't have to deal with the fish, but taking those 5 things out of a vegetarian diet doesn't leave a lot. And the doctors, and we immediately said, well, then maybe we're going to have to eat meat, like that, we don't want to starve her. And the doctor said, actually, we don't want you to add anything in that she's never had before now and complicate these results. So I have this memory of looking through their packet of foods that they sent me that she could eat. And so much of it was meat that I went in to see the dietitian in the practice and said, we're vegetarians and they don't want us to eat meat, but there's not a lot in here. Like, what do you recommend? There must be something else besides vegetables, rice, and seeds and beans, and or whatever I had said, vegetables, rice, and fruit. And she said, have you ever thought about beans? And I said, we're vegetarians. Of course we've thought of beans, but how many nights a week can we eat beans? And she didn't really have an answer for me. She just said, well, maybe look through this packet. And I said, sort of look at this packet. I've dog-eared it. I've searched through it. Like, can you give me some meal plans? Can you give me some, someone to talk to who's done this as a vegetarian? And she didn't have any answers at all for me. And so that's how I had to become MacGyver. So through a combination of searching through vegan recipe boards, searching through recipe boards for people with celiac disease who avoid wheat, searching through information about people who were allergic to nuts. So what do they substitute for nuts? And kind of cobbling it all together. And so there were days where, I had to start cooking dinner around 1 PM because it would take me, a couple of hours to make the ingredients that I needed to make the meal, soaking lentils or soaking sunflower seeds and then mixing 3 kinds of flour together and then letting them bubble somewhere. I mean, it was a giant science experiment. But now I joke that you can tell me any food that you like, tell me what you have to avoid that's in it, and I will make it for you in a way that's.
We need to get you on an episode of Chop.
Yeah, I'm sure that you.
I would love it. I would love it. I wish they would do I've said the other night, I wish they would do like an allergen challenge show. or something like that. Like, here
Yeah.
you go, make lasagna, but dairy free. Here you go.
Oh, that would be amazing. You should write
Yeah.
the producers there.
That would be fun.
Yeah, that's very cool. Well, I saw the MacGyver, and then when you said you did blueberries with coconut oil covered in some confectionery sugar, I'm like, one, that sounds delicious. Two, that's definitely says it has MacGyver written all over it.
Right. Because you put the oil on the blueberries, they just fall off. It just falls off. But if you add something that makes it stick to them, then they stay all together. And so, yeah.
I'm just really thankful that you have taken the time and the effort to really, put your heart and soul into writing this book and putting it out there for people as a resource. Because it's not just words on a page, but you've invested your life into this. I mean, our kids are our lives, and you've invested your time, your experience into this book. And so I'm really excited to read it.
Thank
So
you.
for people who want to pre-order, they can do that. Where can they find you? Where can they pre-order?
Yeah, I mean, literally anywhere books are sold. If you have your favorite local independent bookstore, that's always going to be my first choice, both because I love little stores, but also because the more bookstores know about it, the more likely they'll put it out on a shelf, and other people who might need it will find it. So I'm always a fan of that. But that's not a fit for you. You can certainly get it on bookshop.org, on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, Powell's, all of your big booksellers online and in person will be able to get it for you. It comes out March 15th, but I have heard that some folks have started receiving their pre-orders already. So
Oh, wow.
you can go ahead and do it right now.
Great. And
Yeah.
where can people learn more about you?
You can find me at my website. It's debilewis.com, and it's just DEBILEWIS.com. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Grow the Sunshine.
So anything else that you want to share with us, or anything that we haven't asked you maybe that you want to talk about?
I think I just want to make sure that parents whose children have been given that failure to thrive label, that I find so such a disappointing, lazy kind of label, because failure to thrive is a symptom of something else.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a diagnosis on itself. No child fails to grow at the rate that whatever medical authority has decided is appropriate is doing that for no other reason. And so parents who hear failure to thrive, many of them have told me that, like me, they hear that as failure to feed, and that is not true. That children who can't seem to eat enough, there's something else going on, and has nothing to do with whether or not you gave them peas today, or whether or not you've appropriately set behavioral limits on their eating. You are not the problem. There is something else going on, and it is the medical system's responsibility to work with you, not in opposition to you, to help you find the answer. And you may not love the answer, but it's definitely not going to be that you didn't do enough. You're doing the best you can. Be kind to yourself. Keep pushing for a more appropriate diagnosis.